Mm. The morning my husband handed me divorce papers across the breakfast table, he was smiling. Not the smile I fell in love with 7 years ago, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes when he thought something was genuinely funny. This was different, practiced, the smile of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time and was finally getting to perform it. "I had Marcus draft these last week," he said, sliding the envelope toward me like it was a utility bill. "I think you'll find everything is pretty straightforward." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I looked at the half-eaten bowl of oatmeal in front of me, still steaming. "His name is Trevor. We met when I was 24 and working as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta. He was charming and driven, and he laughed at everything I said, which at 24 felt like the most important quality a person could have. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Savannah at a venue I found and booked and coordinated almost entirely by myself because Trevor was slammed at work. I should have paid more attention to that pattern. I pushed the envelope back across the table. "I haven't had my coffee yet." His smile flickered. "Just for a second. Lydia, I really think we should." "Trevor." I picked up my mug. "I haven't had my coffee yet. I want to be honest about something." I was not calm because I was strong. I was calm because I was in shock. There's a difference, and I think it matters. Because if I had actually understood what was happening, if the full weight of it had landed on me right then, I would have broken apart completely, right there at the kitchen table in my pajamas, with my oatmeal getting cold. What I didn't know yet, sitting there pretending to sip my coffee, was that Trevor had been planning this for 8 months. I found that out later. 8 months of secret meetings with his attorney. 8 months of quietly restructuring assets, shifting accounts, moving things around in ways that were just barely legal and designed to make me look like I had contributed almost nothing to our life together. What I also didn't know, what Trevor certainly didn't know, was that I had spent the last 3 years quietly becoming someone he had completely underestimated. I need to back up. 3 years before the breakfast table, I left the real estate firm. Not because I was fired. Because I had spent 5 years watching other people make decisions with money they didn't fully understand. And I was tired of being the person in the room who actually understood it, but wasn't allowed to say so. I went back to school part-time. Trevor thought I was taking business courses. That's what I let him think. What I was actually doing was finishing the coursework I needed to sit for the CPA exam, and then, after I passed, beginning a graduate certificate in forensic accounting. Forensic accounting is exactly what it sounds like. It's the practice of examining financial records to find fraud, hidden assets, misrepresentation. It's what accountants do when someone is lying about money. I had not planned to use it on my own husband, but 3 years into the coursework I started noticing things, small things. At first, a credit card statement I hadn't seen before, a withdrawal amount that didn't match any expense I could identify, a phone call Trevor took outside in January when it was 32 degrees, pacing the driveway for 20 minutes before coming back inside and saying it was just work. I didn't confront him. I started a folder. By the time he slid that envelope across the breakfast table, the folder had 73 pages. I called my older sister the same morning. She lives in Charlotte, works in HR, and has the kind of practical intelligence that I have always relied on in moments when my own thinking gets too tangled up in feeling. "Get a lawyer," she said immediately. "I know." "Today, Lydia, not next week." "I know. But the accounts, get a lawyer first." I tried. I made 4 calls that afternoon. The first attorney's office told me the earliest consultation available was 3 weeks out. The second had a retainer requirement that made my stomach drop. $15,000 up front, with additional hourly billing after. The third didn't call me back. The fourth was available but had reviewed Trevor's attorney of record and said there was a conflict of interest. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Panera Bread for 45 minutes trying to figure out what to do. This is the part of divorce that nobody tells you about. Not the emotional devastation which everyone warns you about. The logistics. The way the system is structured so that the person with more money has more options. Trevor had already hired Marcus Hale, one of the most well-regarded family law attorneys in the city. His retainer alone would have taken everything I had left in my individual checking account. I drove home. I made a decision. I would represent myself. The moment I told Trevor 2 weeks later, his entire face changed. We were at the kitchen table again. That table had become the site of every difficult conversation in our marriage, I realize now. And I had just informed him that I would be filing my own response to the divorce petition. He stared at me. Then he called for Marcus. Marcus arrived that evening. He sat across from me in my own living room with a leather portfolio and an expression of professional sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. He explained, very carefully and very slowly, that pro se representation in a contested divorce was extraordinarily challenging. That judges didn't have patience for procedural errors. That without proper legal training, I was likely to make mistakes that could permanently damage my position. Trevor sat beside him nodding along, and at one point, when Marcus paused to let his words sink in, my husband looked at me with an expression I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was pity. Genuine, satisfied pity. The look of someone who believes they have already won. Lydia, Trevor said. You can't afford to fight this, you know that. I folded my hands on the table. I'll figure it out. Marcus cleared his throat. With respect. The financial disclosures alone will be. I have a forensic accounting certificate, I said. I think I can manage the financial disclosures. The room went very quiet. Marcus looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at me. I looked at nobody in particular, just the middle distance, keeping my face completely neutral, because I had been practicing that exact moment for 6 weeks, and I knew that if I smiled even slightly I would ruin the whole thing. Since when? Trevor said. Since about 2 years ago, I said. I finished the graduate certificate last spring. Another silence. That doesn't mean... Marcus started. I know it doesn't mean I'm a licensed attorney, I said. I'm not claiming to be one. I'm saying I understand financial documents. I'm saying I've spent 3 years learning exactly how to read the kinds of records that will be submitted in this case. And I'm saying... I stood up, picking up my bag, that I'll see you both in court. I walked to my car and sat there for 10 minutes before my hands stopped shaking. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. I spent the 6 weeks before it preparing the way I used to study for licensing exams, methodically, obsessively, in 2-hour blocks with short breaks, working through every procedural rule and evidentiary standard I could find. My sister came to stay for a week and drilled me on objection procedures. I practiced my opening statement in front of my bathroom mirror every morning until I could deliver it without my voice wavering. I also spent those 6 weeks going through Trevor's financial records with the full toolkit I had spent 3 years acquiring. What I found was worse than I had expected. Trevor was a partner at a logistics consulting firm. Good salary, standard benefits, nothing unusual on the surface. But underneath the surface, in the intercompany transfers, in the contractor payment records, in 3 years of expense reports I had never had any reason to look at before, there was a pattern. He had been systematically inflating business expenses and routing the overstatement back to a separate account I had never seen. Not a dramatic amount each time, $40 here, $120 there. Small enough that no one transaction stood out, but across 3 years, the total was just under $90,000. $90,000 that was sitting in an account that was not included in any of his financial disclosures to the court. I printed everything. I organized it chronologically. I cross-referenced it against his tax filings, his disclosed account statements, and his firm's own public filings, which were available because the firm had a minority institutional investor, and therefore filed certain documents publicly. I put it all in a binder. Then I made 3 copies. Then I contacted the IRS whistleblower office. The morning of the hearing, I wore a charcoal blazer I had bought specifically for the occasion, and I arrived 20 minutes early. I sat at the respondent's table and arranged my documents in the order I planned to use them, and I did not look up when Trevor walked in with Marcus. I heard them, though. The low murmur of their voices. A short laugh. Trevor's. The sound of Marcus's portfolio being set down on the table, and then a third voice, female, from the gallery. Quiet but distinct. Is that Lydia Crane? I kept my eyes on my documents. The judge entered. The Honorable Patricia. I'm sorry. The Honorable Judge Renee Okafor. She had been on the family law bench for 11 years and had a reputation for running an extremely tight courtroom. She looked at the respondent's table, looked at me, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. "Miss Crane," she said, "you're representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded slowly. "Proceed." Marcus opened for the petitioner. He was smooth and organized and clearly very good at what he did. He outlined Trevor's position, that I had been a dependent spouse, that my earning history was limited, that the marital assets were straightforwardly documented, and that Trevor's proposed settlement was more than reasonable given the circumstances. Then it was my turn. I stood up. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to begin by submitting Respondent's Exhibit A, which is a comparative analysis of the petitioner's disclosed financial accounts against a third account not included in his court filings, along with supporting documentation from the petitioner's employer's publicly available records and 3 years of expense reports." Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. I set the binder on the judge's bench. I set copies on the clerk's table and the petitioner's table. Trevor picked his up. I watched him open to the first page. I watched the color leave his face. "Your Honor," Marcus said, recovering, "I'd like to request a brief." "I haven't asked you anything yet, Mr. Hale," Judge Okafor said. She was reading the first page of the exhibit. Then the second. She turned pages in silence for almost 2 full minutes while the courtroom sat completely still. Then she looked up. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Trevor. She looked back at the exhibit. "Mr. Hale," she said, "are you aware of the account referenced in Section 2 of this exhibit?" A pause. "Your Honor, because if you are," she said, "we have a significant problem. And if you aren't," she set the binder down carefully, "we have a different kind of significant problem." Trevor leaned over and said something to Marcus in a low voice. Marcus shook his head slightly. From the gallery, I could hear almost nothing, just the air conditioning and the sound of someone shifting in a seat. Total, absolute stillness. I sat down. I folded my hands. I looked at the judge. What happened next took most of the day. The hearing was recessed twice. During the first recess, I saw Marcus on his phone in the hallway, speaking quietly and quickly, his hand cupped around the receiver. During the second, 2 men I didn't recognize came in and sat in the back of the gallery. They were wearing suits. They were not there to watch a divorce proceeding. I had sent the IRS filing 4 weeks earlier. I had also, after consulting the relevant federal statutes, sent a copy of my documented analysis to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I had not mentioned this to anyone. Not to my sister. Not to anyone. I mention this now only so that the timing makes sense. Judge Okafor reconvened the hearing at 3:15 in the afternoon. She had clearly been in contact with someone during the recess. Her manner was precise and careful in a way that felt deliberate, the way people speak when they know the words are going to matter. She addressed Trevor directly. "Mr. Pretter Crane," she said, "I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what has been presented to this court today." Trevor's attorney put a hand on his arm. "The financial documentation submitted by the respondent has been reviewed and cross-referenced with this court's records," the judge continued. "The discrepancies identified are material. This court will be referring this matter to the appropriate federal authorities. A copy of today's proceedings will be provided upon request." She paused. As to the matter of equitable distribution, she looked at her notes. "The respondent's position is well supported by the evidentiary record. I am prepared to rule." I pressed my hands flat against my thighs under the table. I made myself breathe. The ruling took 11 minutes to read into the record. I got the house. I got half of the disclosed accounts. I got a determination that the undisclosed account constituted marital property, which meant I was entitled to half of that as well. I got a spousal support award based on the economic disparity created by Trevor's hidden assets, and Trevor got to explain himself to the 2 men in suits who were waiting for him in the hallway when we adjourned. I stood outside the courthouse for a long time after. It was one of those early spring days in Atlanta when the weather can't make up its mind. Warm when the sun was out, cold the moment it went behind a cloud. I had my blazer in my bag and my copy of the court's ruling, still warm from the clerk's printer. My sister had driven down that morning and was waiting by my car. When I came to the courthouse doors, she didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me. "Well?" she said finally. "I got the house," I said. She let out a breath that turned into a laugh. "Of course you did." We stood there for a moment. Cars moved through the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a phone was ringing and nobody was answering it. "He really thought I couldn't do it," I said. My sister put her arm around my shoulders. "I know." He looked at me like I stopped. Like I was already gone. Like the outcome was so obvious he didn't even need to try. She nodded. "I'm not angry about the money," I said. And that was true. What I felt about the money was something more complicated than anger. Relief, maybe. And underneath the relief, something harder to name. Vindication isn't quite the right word. Neither is satisfaction. It was more like the feeling of finally being seen accurately. Of having someone, a judge, a courtroom, the public record, confirm what you knew to be true about yourself when nobody else was paying attention. "What are you angry about?" my sister asked. I thought about it. "The smile," I said. "At the breakfast table, the way he smiled when he handed me the papers." She was quiet for a moment. "What about it? He thought it was over," I said. "He thought that smile was the end of the story." I looked down at the ruling in my hand. Still warm. "It wasn't," I said. "There are things I know now that I didn't know on that breakfast table morning, and I want to be honest about them because I think they matter. I know that I was lucky in ways that had nothing to do with what I deserved. I had a sister who could take time off work to come support me. I had 3 years of specialized education that most people in my position don't have. I had the temperament to sit in a law library for 6 weeks and absorb procedural rules, and not everyone does. None of that is moral superiority. It's circumstance, and I'm aware of it. I also know that the system worked the way it did in my case, partly because the evidence was overwhelming and cleanly documented. A different set of facts, a different judge, a different day. Things might have gone another way. Representing yourself in court is genuinely hard. I don't recommend it as a first resort. But I also know this. When Trevor looked at me across that breakfast table and smiled, he made a calculation. He calculated that I was without resources, that I was dependent, that the person he had spent 7 years living with could be assessed, discounted, and set aside. He was wrong about all of it. He was wrong because he had been looking without seeing for 7 years. And when you do that long enough, when you decide that the person across from you is a fixed and limited thing, you stop updating your understanding of them. You freeze them in place. He froze me at 24. Charming, agreeable, deferential 24. He didn't know about the exam scores. The certificate on my laptop desktop. The folder with 73 pages. The federal filings, sent quietly on a Thursday afternoon, 4 weeks before a Tuesday hearing in March. He didn't know, and he hadn't asked, and that is the thing I want to say to anyone who has ever had someone look at them with that particular smile. The smile that means I already know what you are and what you're capable of. You probably know yourself better than they do, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that's enough. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Tuesday in March, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, in the mornings when I'm making coffee in a kitchen that is now entirely mine. Trevor made choices. That's the part that stays with me. Not bad luck, not circumstance, choices. He chose to underreport. He chose to hide $90,000 in an account he thought I'd never find. He chose to smile at me across the breakfast table like I was already a closed chapter. And every one of those choices had a weight to it, a momentum, that eventually landed exactly where it was always going to land. That's not mystical. That's just how actions work. You build something quietly, whether it's a hidden account or a forensic accounting certificate, and eventually what you've built becomes the reality everyone else has to reckon with. Trevor built a lie, carefully and over years. I built a skill set, carefully and over years. We both showed up to the same courtroom on the same Tuesday. Only one of us had actually been paying attention. I think about integrity a lot in that context. Not as a lofty concept, but as a practical one. Integrity, the way I understand it now, is about the consistency between who you are when no one is watching and who you are when everyone is. Trevor assumed those two things could be different indefinitely. He assumed the version of himself he showed in public, the successful partner, the reasonable husband, could coexist forever with the version making quiet transfers into a hidden account on Thursday afternoons. They can't. They never can. The gap between those two versions is exactly where everything eventually collapses. What I did, the studying, the late nights, the 6 weeks of procedural rules in a law library, that wasn't heroic. I want to be clear about that. It was just consistent effort, applied over time, in a direction I had chosen. Intelligence isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the person who keeps going when it would be easier to stop. Who takes the exam again after failing it the first time? Who opens the folder one more time even when the numbers make her sick? And the resilience part, that's the one I'm still learning. Because resilience isn't toughness. It's not performing strength when you feel broken. It's smaller than that. It's sitting in a Panera parking lot for 45 minutes when every option looks closed, and then driving home and making a different decision. It's practicing your opening statement in the bathroom mirror until your voice stops shaking. It's showing up to the courtroom 20 minutes early and arranging your documents in the order you planned, and not looking up when the door opens. Trevor looked at me and saw what I used to be. That was his real mistake. Not the hidden account, not the expense reports, not even the smile. The real mistake was deciding that he already knew me completely, that there was nothing left in me that could surprise him. People who love you, actually love you, keep asking. They keep updating their understanding of who you are. They stay curious. Trevor stopped being curious about me a long time before that breakfast table. And you can't protect yourself from someone you've stopped seeing clearly. I'm 31 years old. I have a house and a ruling and a folder I never have to open again. I have a sister who drove 4 hours on a Tuesday and stood by my car and asked, well? With the kind of restraint that is its own form of love. I have, finally, an accurate understanding of what I'm capable of. That last part is the one I'd most like to keep.